And that's it for me. I'll go ahead and turn things over to our chair for today's session, Chris Taylor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate your
Oh,
I think we'll start with just some introductions of myself and the rest of the panel. We'll jump into the presentation. My name is Chris Taylor. I am the Chief Inclusion Officer at the Minnesota Historical Society.
Good morning. My name is Veronica Gallardo. I'm the Operations and Collections Manager at the Casemate Museum in Fort Monroe, Virginia.
Morning. My name is Kyle Parsons. I am the Minnesota Historical Society.
Hello, my name is Dina Bailey. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Mountaintop Vision LLC. Previously, I was the Director of Educational Strategies at the National Center for Civil Liberties in Atlanta, Georgia.
All right, thank you. Uh, so today we're really looking at talking about diversity and inclusion as a strategy for your museum and what can that look like. And the argument that we're making is that typically D&I has been positioned as a program or as an initiative within the museum, but we're really wanting to uh, elevate that to become a core strategy or a core function within the organization. It brings challenges, but it also brings some opportunities uh, for your organization to expand your reach, tell new narratives, or those types of things. And so we're really hoping that you'll take some things that we can learn from you as well. Um, just real quick to give you a couple of definitions in terms of how we're defining diversity and inclusion. I've heard it explained that diversity really, you can look at diversity, the word, as a noun. So it's a thing, it's referring to difference, it's something that really we don't have control over. There's a lot of different types of diversity. Um, there's a lot of different types of diversity, but inclusion really is more of a verb. It requires that we take action. It's intentional, it's proactive, and it's strategic. And so within what we in the museum can control or what we have influence over, again, diversity is happening regardless of what we're doing. But inclusion is something that we can control. That's something that we can be intentional about, proactive, and that we can make happen within our organizations. So when we look across the field, a lot of our professional organizations, whether it's ASLH or AAM, National Council on Public History, Society for American Archivists, all of these organizations are building strategic plans that include diversity and inclusion. So the inertia in our field is building to the point where action is inevitable. And that's where we're really wanting to be proactive about creating strategies for our organizations to meet the challenges that come with more diversity in our country, in our audience, and meeting the needs of those folks. And so we see a lot of diversity councils and diversity statements within our organizations these days. But what we're arguing is that while those are good steps in the right direction, really strategy is kind of the next step that comes with that, and that diversity councils can talk about vision and whatever else, but oftentimes diversity councils are people who have full-time jobs already in another part of the museum and being asked to do this as an extra thing. And statements are dangerous because they can make us feel good, like we've put out a statement. We're saying to the public, this is who we want to be, yet we don't create that change within our organizations to be able to really live that value that we've stated in our diversity statement. So thinking about some of these things, we had conversations as we were putting this together about what are some of the obstacles that we see in terms of diversity and inclusion. And uh, some of the obstacles that we've identified are mission. Oftentimes, our mission in the traditional sense that we typically define our mission doesn't allow time for diversity and inclusion work. Um, we see diversity as programs or outreach, and so it's really kind of uh, housed in an externally facing community engagement or community outreach person or function, which really does not do a whole lot internally for organizations to create the kind of change to be inclusive. Um, Traditional museum practices, the way museums work have engaged a certain segment of the population that has become our traditional audience, but we need to evolve our practices to make sure that we're looking at other segments of the population that we want to engage with our work, and then human and financial resources. And I'm not saying human resources as the department, but I'm saying we don't have the capacity within our organizations to do this work, or it's viewed as extra work, or we don't resource it financially like it needs to be resourced. And so these are barriers that we've seen. We would love to hear from you. What other barriers to inclusion have you experienced within your organization? And we have a question that I believe will pop up on the screen here. Um, and so we would just love for you to type in, you can give us 1 or 2 words, or you can give us a sentence, whatever you'd like. But we would love to hear what some of the barriers that you've experienced are.
Tradition.
Tradition, lack of information, diverse communities are hard to reach, staff apathy, lack of diversity internally in our staff and members, time, tradition,
Bulk of collection.
so collections not reflecting, perception as being non-inclusive, unaware, lack of ties with community members, museum-wide initiatives beyond just programming. These are all great. Thank you for sharing these. We're seeing, I guess what I'm seeing, and I would open it up to my panel to see if you all saw any themes in there, but one of the themes that I'm seeing is a lot of this stems from obstacles that we have internally, whether it's lack of diversity in staff or collections or, those types of systems that we have internally. I don't know if you all have other observations.
Yeah, I think we'll get into this a little bit later as well, but thinking about the interpretation. So I saw a lot about staff apathy, being unaware, like those types of things, not mission and collections not really being related. And some of that I think can be true, right? It's a fact that this is my mission, or these are my collections, as an example. But I think sometimes we have been interpreting our mission the same way. We've been looking at our collections in the same way. We've been thinking about the exact line of our strategic plan in the same way. And so sometimes it's not so much those things as it is reinterpreting the wording. And I think we're going to talk about that later, but I noticed some of that. And I think, one, our missions need to be broader. We need to think about our collections, but two, the collections that we have, maybe we kind of turn those at a different angle and see them from a different lens.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I would just add, definitely includes that sense of internal obstacles. And felt like a pretty consistent theme was that idea of either not having familiarity with communities. One person said, communities are inclusive to themselves, which are hard to get into. So I think we're gonna talk about this later, of course, as well. But that idea of how do we go out and do the work? We are talking to people where they are at, meeting them where they are at, and how do we get beyond kind of that traditional sense and maybe that even that.
Yeah, that's another good point, and I think as we get into the bulk of the presentation and as our panel starts to share some of their examples and experiences, we will address a number of these things. And again, we'll have some time, I think, for Q&A at the end if we're not able to. But one of the things that we really want to talk about today, one of the ways that we're really internalizing this at the Minnesota Historical Society is really thinking about, getting our house in order or, the internal work that we need to do in terms of shifting the institution to be more inclusive. It doesn't exclude the fact that we still need to be doing external work and community engagement type things and programming, but really I think we've not looked internally at our systems and our structures within our organizations that can be barriers as well. You all pointed out a number of them, but really thinking about, what does systemic change look like in museums and how do we challenge our norms and our values and attitudes that come from the traditions of museums. And we know that museums in this country were founded on very elitist and kind of the idea of providing culture for the uncultured, and how do we move away from that and start to challenge some of those norms and values and attitudes. Workplace culture and work practices. How do we do our work in the environment within which we do it? We talk a lot about diversifying the field, but our cultures within our organizations, when you bring diversity into the institution, you're asking people to assimilate into a Eurocentric culture. And how do we start to change that? And how do we, within our work practices, share authority and these types of things? And so this is really what we'd like to start to address in this presentation today, and really thinking through what this might look like. And we'd love to get your input again at the end of the presentation to see how this resonates with you. With that, I'll pass it over to our panel, who will start to talk about some of their experiences in terms of looking at the internal work within museums.
Good morning again, Veronica from the Casemate Museum. I think we all have similar examples of where we are with our museum, where let's just talk about the authority of museums. Our sites all have the authority of being transparent and inclusive because we shape knowledge. We all understand that we are in the business of making meaning in our historic sites. I'll also say that, as I'm not sure what background your museums are. My museum is a history museum, and so I consider us doing public history, and I really reflect on the whole bottom-up interpretation at our site. So today we understand that we have to be relevant to 21st century, and we understand that we have to serve our community. I'll just give you an example of where we are at my site. President Obama placed Fort Monroe on the National Monument in 2011. There's a numerous amount of history that we have there, from the rich history from Native Americans to the first African arrivals, to the contraband decision, to Jefferson Davis imprisonment, to Coast Artillery, to the architecture. We have tons and tons of really rich history, and I believe all of us here and you that are listening probably have significant and diverse histories. and stories that we're interpreting. But how do we do this in a way that we can include diverse stories and also do this within internal rather than just external. We all agree that inclusion is a critical piece to the interpretive parameters and challenges of museum historical representation. I believe, and I think that we're all understanding this, that where museums are there to reconstruct American history experience in terms to 21st century existence. So how do we be more inclusive? I mean, this is the question that I think we're all asking ourselves, and I think that we have in the past 10 years we've definitely have used ways to be more inclusive through certain programs, but who are the people that are developing this program? That's really the question. So like many here, we continue to challenge the traditional ways, and I'm a manager, and I manage. I'll tell you, I'm not in the senior level, but my challenges and what I attempt to do in my organization is challenge the traditional ways of the field, and that's by making aware my colleagues on what new things are being addressed in the field in regards to diverse and inclusiveness. We also have to continue to encourage critical discourse and apply strategies regarding D&I in our organization. And this is throughout the field. This is in education, interpretation, collections, exhibit people, public programs. I mean, we all can do this within our departments. So like many of you, the organizations that you work for, I believe that we recognize that there's a lack of D&I. Sorry. So how do we implement intentional D&I in our strategies, and what does that mean to be more diverse and inclusive? Well, I'll just elaborate a little bit more on what my institution has been doing, that really some of the programs or some of the efforts, initiatives have really affected internal and external. It really has looked at our institution, the individual person, the staff, and the community. Just recently, the past year, we've decided to be a venue for a radio talk called Race, Let's Talk About It. This was a really, really big risk that our organization took. And this radio talk addressed 4 different topics. One was the flag is down for what? I mean, the flag is down, now what? White privilege, race and politics, and race and religion. And, a lot of our staff members were, they weren't sure, they didn't know how they felt about this. But I think it was a really good experience for us, because not only did we put our institution out there, but staff had time we ended up reflecting, and also we engaged with community about this topic. The other event that we recently have done and we're involved in, it's called African Arrival Day. And during that program, we collaborated with grassroots organizations and the community and other historic sites to develop public programs. But during this time, what we were trying to develop is intentional strategies that we can include a different type of audience, and that reflects the history that we're trying to interpret. And during that time, staff, sometimes they had some issue of letting go that authority of that they're the programmer, that they're the interpreters, that this is, my museum or my story, and that's just very traditional and old school. so that was another initiative, and something that we looked internal and external. The other thing that I have done, and it's a way that I decided to really bring D&I into my department and also help share my passion, or what I feel that it's also important in the field, was I created this internship project, and it specifically looked at well, first of all, the internship project was, we worked with HU University, which is an all-black university, and specifically wanted a person to come in there, a young person to come in there and look at our exhibits and let us know where do we lack representation of our stories. And that really, really helped our staff members to understand a little bit more on, where the areas that we need to work on. So with all the stuff that I've just said, the story, my experience, I kind of feel that, there's personal reflection of staff's biases during some of these programs. I think it was really helpful for us to do these initiatives and then sit back down and kind of talk about it. And it was eye-opening on how some people felt, how it, there was an incident where, one of my staff members, was, she was crying, and because of the type of talk that we had with Race Let's Talk About It. And I think that this is the internal work that we have to do in order for us to move forward with including diverse interpretation and reaching out to the community. It's also empowering to reflect on these issues internally, and it's also a social change that historic sites and museums are involved in. And
all right, thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Veronica. So we'll move to Dina now, who will talk about some of the examples that she has, both in her museum career and working as a consultant.
Yes, thank you, everyone. So I think one of the things that we've noticed from the general chat, and certainly that Veronica has been pointing out as well, is that it seems like we're all in a different boat. We are all thinking about diversity at a different pace. It looks different. We have different populations within our community. And so as we're thinking about this, sometimes it seems even more overwhelming because we can't just say, here is what we're defining diversity to be for everyone. Here is what we are defining as best practices that everyone should follow one at a time. And so this slide is really about being intentional and building one community. So when we're thinking strategically about our community, we don't want to be thinking about us and them. We don't want to be thinking externally and internally. It is one community. And I think that Chris originally brought this up when he was talking about kind of how we see the work that we're doing. And so often we put diversity and inclusion conversations and work into programming and outreach. And so when we're thinking about being strategic and being intentional, I think it's really important to start thinking about one community. We might have sub-communities. We might think of our internal work as a sub-community, our external work as a sub-community, our Native American population as a sub-community. But really, if we're looking at this as one community with one goal, I think that we will move faster and we will move in the same direction. And so for that reason, I came up with talking about internal versus external, and then the need to create a plan so that it doesn't just fall into one department, it doesn't just fall into a focus on a Native American group, an African American group, the Latino group. Those sub-communities have special needs, just like your internal staff does. But if you can think about all of that as a subgroup, as we talk about an overall strategy, I think that's very important. So moving on then to this next page, organizational cultures, your culture, your community. Looking at the internal side of this when we're thinking about staff, what are the building blocks of your organization? I've listed a few here: mission, vision, values, strategic plan. What else? Just take a moment to kind of write in, what else do you think of when you think about the building blocks of your organization? Any ideas? Or have I listed them all? Great. Collection management plan, very significant. Exhibit diversity. Preservation plan, programming plan, history. We often talk about plans. Here we've got people, staff, volunteers, board, other stakeholders. Sometimes we separate out operation plans to strategic plans. So I think my point here is thinking about these building blocks, because often we might think about the mission, we might think about our strategic plan, but we forget how important it is to think about all of the other areas that you all have listed. So thinking about actually creating a programming plan, thinking about the need for this to be addressed, diversity and inclusion to be addressed in your collections management plan, so that there is intentionality behind it, but also so that you can measure. I think when you write things out and when you are looking at them strategically, that gives accountability, which is so important to diversity and inclusion. And we were talking about kind of who are we talking to, what are we saying to them, how do we focus on ensuring that when one person leaves, that your diversity and inclusion efforts don't leave with that person. Part of it is this intentionally adding diversity and inclusion to the foundations of your organization. So intentionally building and solidifying your organization builds a stronger culture. And as we were talking about early on, Chris was kind of defining diversity and inclusion. I know that he and I have talked about the idea that diversity can be so many different things, and it's not necessarily the same at each organization. And so really focusing in on inclusion. How do you add inclusion to the interpretation of your mission? How do you add inclusion into your values and then act on those? Just using the values as an example, I know that so often, both for our mission and our values, we put them up on our website, we memorize them perhaps, we look at them during our annual report, but how do we ensure that it becomes part of the performance plan? How do we ensure that it becomes part of the job descriptions that we're putting out for new employees? So thinking about the building blocks of your organization and how insinuating that into everything that you do actually changes and strengthens your culture. All right, and so just kind of reiterating here, it's not us versus them, it's just us. And so we may be thinking about a particular group of people. I think that is the interesting and complex part about diversity and inclusion work, that when you're seeing people or groups of people, they have particular unique qualities that you're highlighting, that you're appreciating, that you're working with, but they are all a part of us. So it's building empathy within your staff, it's building empathy within your community to appreciate both the strength, the commonalities, as well as the differences. And this idea that we're not trying to separate from each other, but we're really bringing all of us together to be part of one community. So more complex, more beautiful, more meaningful when we think of all of us together versus just trying to tell someone something, trying to educate someone, trying to force someone into something. If we can all come together and admit that we're all learning this at the same time, I think it goes down a lot easier for all of us. And then we talk about why we need to create community engagement plans. I've already hinted, I think, that creating plans and then ensuring that diversity and inclusion is a part of all of these plans is really important. And when we think about the plans that we have, an interpretive plan, a programming plan, a strategic plan, an operational plan, sometimes we forget about community engagement and really being focused on a particular group, perhaps at a particular time or as a 3-year initiative. But how do you keep that going after your 3 years? So I know that often people want to do a single program during Black History Month, for example, or they want to do a program during Women's History Month, but then the diversity and inclusion falls off because you're checking a box, or you're saying, well, since they came to the first one, then they won't be coming to, something else, or we think they'll automatically be coming to something else. And so when you create a plan, again, you can check against other opportunities. So you can say, yes, we've done these 3. How could we insinuate that something into every program that we're doing? I see that Bev is talking about personalizing every contact that you have. And again, I would go back to internal communication as well as external, and thinking about that being a part of your engagement plan, something that you are committing to. And cultural competency comes with that as well, in understanding the different cultural nuances between community groups, and not just ensuring that your frontline staff knows that, but that when a supervisor is talking to a supervisee, or when you have an intern, that you're really making a concerted effort to be thinking about all of those points as well. Not to go into line by line about community engagement plans, because I think they are, again, very unique to each organization, but really thinking about what communities you have and want to highlight, or perhaps even what communities you don't have. Some of us are in towns, in regions, in areas where we don't have a lot of racial diversity. You may be thinking about gender diversity. You may be thinking about political diversity. I think that as we're talking, there are certain groups that are more visible than others, and that's not to kind of let you off the hook one way or the other, but you need to decide what you're looking at for the next year. You need to decide what you're making a part of your strategic plan, whether it's about age or race or gender identity or education level. All of those things have their own beauty and complexity with them, and so we encourage that.
Mountaintop Vision consultant organization. We're going to hear from Kyle Parsons now, who is the inclusion and community engagement manager at the Minnesota Historical Society, with some examples of some of the work he's been doing there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. So, like you said, my name's Kyle Parsons, and I just wanted to talk through a few of the examples we have for the Historical Society, the Minnesota Historical Society, that is. And really one of our approaches where we started on our kind of D&I journey a few years ago was around giving staff a voice. So I think one of the most important tools that we created was our employee engagement survey. And this survey was designed for us to measure our organizational culture and for us to really take a look at how does our staff feel. That was pretty extensive and elaborate, but it doesn't have to be at organizations around the country. It can be as simple as asking the question of, what do you think our culture looks like here? For us, we measured things like, how do we communicate? How do teams work? Do people feel safe? Do people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, meaning they don't need to conceal or hide a part of their, or multiple parts of their identities? It was really fascinating stuff that we got back. One thing we learned at the Historical Society is that a lot of people felt supported by their supervisors, they felt supported by their teams or by a direct manager. When we asked questions about their teams, they said, yeah, I feel good about this place. And then when we asked questions of the organization, we got a much different response. People were a lot less certain or had outwardly, negative perceptions of how the organization handles people's careers. And we really learned a lot about how our people felt. And I think a next step to that is we try to create opportunities to not just hear from people through our engagement survey, but also opportunities for people to come out and talk. So if you're familiar with the World Cafe, it's a facilitated conversation where people move around the room, sit at different tables, but get asked the same questions. So they're interacting with different groups and different facilitators, but everybody's looking at the same issues. And we really do these to understand our own culture better. And this was an opportunity for people who may not have been engaged with the survey or who, didn't want to be anonymous, because our survey was anonymous, which we think is important. The World Cafe gives people an opportunity to show up, talk, and hear from others. That's another really key part, is you're not just saying, this is how I feel, you're also hearing how people in your department or people you may not have met who work for your organization are also responding. And finally, we tried to implement brown bags. So this is our term, but I'm sure they're different throughout organizations across the country. But for us, a brown bag is over the lunch hour typically, and it's an opportunity for staff to come and learn about whatever the topic is. We found one of the most important ways, whenever you're going to ask for advice, right? Whenever you're asking for feedback, you better be willing to listen, and you better be willing to share what you've learned. So a lot of people say to us when we are rolling out, our D&I, our diversity and inclusion tools like the engagement survey, people always ask us, what are you going to do with this information? Where can I find this? And we've created this brown bag series where we're trying to do one a month where people have an opportunity to learn what our staff, and we're very fortunate to have a staff of 6 people working on diversity and inclusion at different levels. But we want a larger staff to be able to interact, ask questions, push back, give feedback, help shape the direction of where we're going. And all of that is really the goal, is you want people to buy in and have a sense of, I'm responsible for the culture and I help to shape who we are as an organization. And I think that it really cuts both ways, because if people are feeling engaged and they're feeling like they have a chance to share their voice, their opinion, their experiences, they're going to buy into the culture a lot more and want it to be a strong culture. However, if they don't feel that way, you're going to disenfranchise people, and you're definitely not going to get the best work out of people that you could. So beyond just giving staff a voice, we also try to give staff opportunities to learn and grow. We created something called the Diversity Learning Collaborative, which was a new experiment where we created a pretty brief curriculum, and we get between 20 and 25 staff members together every semester for about 12 weeks. And we ask these people to meet for 1 hour a week on Mondays when our museum is closed. And really just talk about some of the issues that are facing contemporary museums and the diversity conversation that is happening and how we become more inclusive spaces. I think one of the most important things we've done with our diversity learning collaborative, as we call it, is we've created what we think is not just a safe space, but hopefully a brave space, an opportunity for people to come in and ask questions. And we realize that we're on a journey and that there are different people, that everyone's kind of on a personal journey, I should say. We have one as an organization, but there's also the individual who has, one second here. There's also the individual who has personal work to do. And we understand that as people are working through, I have questions about, what is privilege? What does that mean? And how do I interact with that? And other people, the rabble-rousers who we love so much, who have been having these conversations for many years, it's a space for them to come into. And we try to invite everyone to the conversation. We think it creates a sense of staff unity, but it also lets people hear some of these things more consistently. What we find a lot in our department, the Department of Inclusion and Community Engagement, is we're having these conversations every day. But I'm sure many of you are saying this is not germane to the work we do, and this is not, this is a quarter of somebody's job, or it's a really new concept of how to become inclusive. So by creating a space for people to talk about that, and while ours has a curriculum and is, done every semester, we think something as simple as a book club might be a great way to start, or hopping on a blog, going and looking at the Incluseum. Again, that's the Incluseum, and reading what they have to do. I think you find a lot in this work that as you start to read articles about how museums are being inclusive, if you find one, you found 100, because you're going to be linked to other sites and other people who are having this conversation around the country. And finally, back to something we referenced in the questions earlier, giving staff a chance to engage with communities. It's just such an important strategy and approach, because many people throughout organizations, especially larger organizations, find that they don't have a tie to inclusion in their jobs. And I think that's really damaging when people don't see inclusion as a goal for every member of an organization. I loved what Dina was saying about one community. I think it's really important that people feel not only that they're helping to help the institution grow, but also doing that self-work. And so giving people an opportunity to go out and sit at a table and be in, someone else's space. We talk about what an important strategy it is, because I'm not sure museum employees consider this, but we're constantly being invited. Other organizations, and we talk about communities, and whether that means people of color or other marginalized groups, but there are spaces that exist outside of ours where people are doing this work and having these conversations around what are our needs, what do we want for our children, how do we want our history to be told. But often we start by inviting people to our space to talk. We think it's really important that you kind of showing up to other people's events and accepting their invitations. It's something that any staff member can do, and they're going to start to grow their own network, but also their cultural understanding of what's going on in your city or your town or even your state. And the more you do that, the more you're able to invite people back to your space and say, hey, come help us get better. And the same way that you've made me feel so welcomed here, I want to do that for you. So that's something that can happen on an individual level. That's something you can be very strategic about. At MNHS, we created in the past year a strategy around tabling. And so we try to use our tabling as a way to go out and say, we have a Somali initiative going on right now where we're mounting an exhibit in 2018. So how can we build our relationships now so that it's not 2017, a few months before the exhibits go up, and we say, let's go out and talk to the community. How can we in 2015 and 2016 start talking to people and letting them know about all the services we have available, so that when our exhibit does open up, or when we do offer public programs, it's people who say, oh, I was there last week, or oh, I was there a few months ago and it was so much fun. My kids love this other exhibit that has nothing to do with our particular culture, just has to do with the state or a story we want to learn.
Thank you, Kyle. And so we'll be getting to some questions and answers here soon, but I do want to acknowledge that, we're talking about these examples within our organizations of success, but the road or the path to success for all of us, none of us, was all success. And so I'd love the panel to talk maybe a little bit about, some opportunities or some challenges that they've had, or, ideas around, when they felt comfortable taking a risk, or maybe when it was something where it was too risky, or how do you make those decisions, or what were some of the barriers that you had to overcome, or where were some times that you failed? Oftentimes failure is seen as a negative thing, but failure is what pushes us forward. It's how we learn. It's how we tweak to move forward to be successful in the future. So maybe we'll just go down the line again, and if you could talk about either some risks that you had to take and how you decided that those were acceptable risks, or some constructive failures that you've had along the way.
Sure. This is Veronica, and I will elaborate more on my initiative with the internship project, which, we had 6 interns coming in to participate in a numerous, in whether it was education or collections, and I decided to write a D&I internship program and purposely go and reach out to HU University, which is about maybe 2 miles away from our museum. And when I developed this and I gave it to my director, he had some concerns and questions, because really, kind of the description was that we were looking for someone that can help us move forward with better interpreting the history and the language, I guess, that I used. One of my colleagues says that it's too apologetic, and this was a challenge for me because I didn't want to change my internship description. I thought it was really good. I thought it got to the point, and I kind of felt that students would really like this challenge, especially if we're trying to change this institution, and try to make sure that we include different stories. So eventually I left it as it was, and this program has been, I guess I've been doing this internship or managing this internship for a year, and it really has helped staff to interact with different people, and really get a sense of what young, young diverse minorities, or how do they look at the museum? How do they feel that it can change and help other students kind of come in and feel like they're represented?
All right, Kyle.
Yeah, and I think I just want to piggyback off Veronica real quick when I talk about this. I think I think we see this as a risk in museums, this idea of hiring people from non-traditional pipelines. And I like to use the example of my own career, and just that I'm not someone who came in with the museum background, but I represented a lot of the diversity, both in my my cultural background and my age, that my organization didn't have. And we talk about stretch assignments a lot. We talk about growing people and developing our own talent. And I think I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity I've had to do that. But I think a part of that has been supervisors like Chris helping me to understand, hey, here are the ways traditional museums have worked, and here's how you might run up against that. And I do think it has to be very intentional, but I also think you grow people then who are going to help shape your culture and shape it in a new way. But the example I wanted to talk about was actually one from this past year where we decided we wanted to write a large federal grant around trying to do inclusion work in our institution. And it was a pretty big risk in our thought, one, that we are not grant writers, and we learned about that process and how challenging that can be, how labor intensive they are. But even more so, we were writing things like we want to create a cultural competence toolkit, and we want to do an HR policy and procedure review within our own institution. Not only did we feel like this was a risk because we don't see that kind of work being done in a large scale way, but we had to get people around our organization to say, yeah, I can buy into this. And I think one of the reasons it was, that people did sign off is we said, okay, we're applying for this now. In a year from now, we might start this work. So you need to start taking the steps that you can do, like our HR or our finance department. When we do look at our policies and procedures, assuming we get this grant, we're gonna start to do an overhaul, and we're gonna start to really talk about ways that this place needs to change and update and improve. And I think that was a risk because there's always the opportunity for people to say no. And I don't think we got any firm no's. We got a few raised eyebrows and a couple people saying, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that. But more than anything, we had a lot of buy-in and people saying, yeah, I think we're ready to take this step, and I hope we do that. But we know it's a risk because we're going to start going through our organization, hopefully with relatively fine-tooth comb, and once we know that information, we're going to have to start pushing for change.
Dina?
Yeah, so this is Dina Bailey again. One of my examples has to do with a huge exhibition, and I think we didn't know quite how huge it would be for our city when we did it. I'm talking about my work at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. And for a long time, actually, before the Freedom Center ever opened, the board had been talking about doing without sanctuary lynching photography in America. And they had been talking about it for years, never kind of got that off the ground. And so when I came in, it was brought up, and I said, yes, let's do it. Our leadership said great, and they put four staff members who were all under the age of 30 in charge of this project. And I think we all were so enthusiastic about doing something different that we didn't quite think about how scary doing a lynching exhibition in Cincinnati, Ohio could be. And the closer we got to the opening, I think the more nervous our board got about doing this and having such young people in charge of the exhibition, and not just the exhibition, but the educational materials, the trainings, the marketing. We were an interdepartmental team. And so questions kept coming down about, have you thought about children and not allowing children to see this? Have you thought about how you're going to do X, Y, and Z? And I think that the leadership allowing us to take on this huge project, but also pushing after the fact in terms of thinking it an acceptable risk, but also wanting to make sure that we had all of the parameters behind, actually pushed the four of us into a place that we wouldn't have been before. And in the end, although there was a lot of nervousness about it, because we had thought about all of the worst case scenarios, none of those things actually happened. And the benefit was that we brought an exhibition to the community that I think was very much needed at the time to start conversations in Cincinnati. But also, I think that it changed the way that we worked at the Freedom Center. It changed how we started talking to community groups, how we brought in partners on projects. We brought the local university in to have conversations. So I think that it really changed the way that we looked internally and ended up being a really good risk to take. But in the beginning, they were just letting some young people do an exhibition that they had wanted to do for several years. Another example that I would have from the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta is the idea of changing our ideas of measurement and success. So when I first came and we opened the center in Atlanta, Georgia, everybody wanted blockbuster programming. That's always the phrase, right? Blockbuster programming. Hundreds of people, big names. And instead, what I ended up doing was really creating a plan to get into the community. And so crazily, I will say, if that's a word. We did over 100 programs that first year that we were open, which is kind of ridiculous. But we had, at many of them, 30 people. We had 50 people. We had maybe 100 people. But we were doing it for specific groups over a long period of time. And so we built a really strong base that then has grown in further years. So I think that the risk to doing smaller, dedicated programs rather than big programs is something that people get nervous about, but in the end, it ends up having good benefits, at least for us. That was an acceptable risk.
All right, thank you. We had a question come in about collections, and we're going to get to questions here real quick, but I do think that we have a project going on that I think Kyle can talk about in terms of addressing collections. And what we actually found is not really all that easy to do. So
Yeah. So the question came in about MNHS looking at about collecting items from underrepresented audiences such as LGBTQ communities. And we're working on a project right now that started out, we are actually trying to collect around Black Lives Matter. And the thought was, let's do a collection project because this is important history that is happening in our, in our everyday lives right now. We're seeing this happen. We should be collecting this. And we got into this institutional conversation of, okay, who have we been? What relationships do we have? And how do we go and approach people who we haven't historically collected from and with? And I think it's been a real challenge. And one of the things we learned is we need to start with an admission of where we have been. And one of the things we've spent a lot of time on internally is trying to shape a message to say, we want to collect this history, and here's why. And from that point, I think you have to go two ways. We've realized we haven't done a good job. We don't have enough African American history in our collections, in our physical collections, in our archives, and wherever you want to look. African Americans in Minnesota have been underrepresented. So we want to right that, we want to change that going forward. But two, we want to say you have important history happening right now that affects all Minnesotans. It's our job to preserve that, to help you preserve that for generations into the future. Somebody made a really strong tie. We have in Minnesota, we have a community in St. Paul called the Rondo neighborhood, where a major highway was put in the 50s that displaced hundreds of black families. And we're trying to point to that and say, if only we had had a collection effort that was strong and that was focused in the 1950s, we would be able to talk about Rondo in a more comprehensive way today. Let's not make that mistake again. So it's about acknowledging where you've been and also helping community partners and individuals to really understand we know what is happening for you right now is important, and we want to work with you to document that. But it is challenging.
yes, it is. It's the work we do, right? So this is our last slide, and then we can kind of just open it up. But we do have a poll question for you all on this slide too. And thinking about empowering individuals or thinking about empowering yourselves, right? So thinking about what your sphere of influence is within your organization, what can you do right away to start the transformation to a more inclusive organization? And things that we would love to know about are you on your personal journey? Are you doing your own work in cultural competency or learning about diverse communities and how to connect. What can you influence within your organization? Where do you sit in the organization, and what can you influence? Who are the champions that are above you that you can start to manage up and influence in terms of inclusion within your organization? Have you created community engagement plans? What are your challenges? So we just want to just open this up and think about, what are you all doing, or what are you influencing within your organization, or what can you take from today and go back and so we have kind of consistency of diverse programming involving community partners in mutually beneficial ways. That's a great way to start to make headway.
And I think an example of this came up the other day. We were in a meeting with our diversity and inclusion kind of committee. It's a group that's supposed to represent all of the different departments in our institution. And we were talking about, I should say, I was talking very passionately about hiring practice. And one of my colleagues raised her hand and said, I don't have any influence. I'm not a manager. I don't hire people. And I said, I think we need to move. We need to shift our paradigm from I don't have the power to what do I have influence over. So we talked about the fact that you might not be a hiring manager, but are you on hiring committees? Where do you promote jobs when you hear we have a job within our organization? What are you telling your colleagues? And what are you looking for? Who are you valuing? What are you saying? What skills are you talking about needing on your team? So these are all ways, as well as hiring interns and selecting interns and recruiting interns and all these different talent pipelines that we do have influence over, instead of just automatically going to that deficit thinking, oh, I don't hire people, so I don't impact how we make hiring decisions.
Yeah, and we're seeing, a number of answers related to inclusive programming throughout the year. Also seeing that hiring is coming up within someone's sphere of influence, but also helping staff or pushing staff to include interactives that are inclusive in the organization.
I think that's important too, that we've mentioned, kind of sometimes it seems like an aside, but we've mentioned brown bag lunches, we've mentioned other professional development opportunities, and I think those things are so important. Kyle talked earlier about doing a book club, and I remember being at the Freedom Center. I bought my staff a book about conflict management. And then I did two different versions. I did one version for my department of all of those who were supervisors, and then I did a separate one for a separate book club for all of those who were supervisees, and talking about kind of conflict on each of their levels, but also allowing them to talk about conflict kind of with their supervisors or vice versa. And I think providing those opportunities to say conflict happens everywhere. Let's just talk about how to deal with it, or to get small groups. We talked about safe spaces and brave places. Again, remembering to create those for your staff as well. And professional development doesn't have to be, coming to a conference. It doesn't have to be bringing a consultant in. It can be something as small as talking about an article once a week or having a book club. So I think that's really important.
Some of the other things that I'm seeing come in here are, points about getting outside of museums and understanding our communities. And I can't stress how important that is as just foundational to any type of inclusion work that we in museums are going to do. For so long, we have been dictating other people's culture for them. And it's about understanding the community and understanding nuances within the audiences that we are seeking to serve. And until we do that, we can't really be inclusive. We're going to continue to be paternalistic organizations that are making decisions for communities on what's important within their culture. And that's what we really need to get away from.
Yeah, I think a collections example here is really important. That when we say, we have this type of collection within our organization, what do we do with it? So do we go to our allies, go to our partners, and really allow them to have their voice and create something with you, or talk about how a collection should be utilized or understood or kept within a safe space. I think the other thing that we talk about that we don't talk about, we talk so often about bringing in new items, bringing in objects and archival documents, etc., to have a more diverse collection. But sometimes I go back to thinking about using what we already have and looking at it from a different lens. So my example in the past has been, okay, you have the hat that Abraham Lincoln wore. Let's not talk about Abraham Lincoln. Let's talk about the person who cleaned his hat on a daily basis, right? Let's not talk about the fine china. Let's talk about the people who made that china. So really just looking at your collections, whatever they might be, and ensuring that you're giving them the proper respect, but also looking at the collections that you have from a different lens.
So we have about 7 minutes left. And so I think, if you in the general chat box want to just start firing off questions, we'll answer as many as we can as we have time to do. If you scroll through the general chat, and we can put them in there again, all of our email addresses are there. And please feel free to reach out to any one of us directly if there are resources that came up during the presentation, or if you would like to have conversations further on any of the things that you've heard here. I think everybody would be happy to continue the conversation. But please go ahead. If you have questions, just go ahead and type them into the general chat, and we'll just kind of respond rapid fire.
So in terms of good community engagement plans that we would recommend, I wrote a chapter in a book that was edited by Kristen Gallus and James DeWolf Perry. Sorry, I just forgot his last name. But it's about interpreting difficult histories, and specifically interpreting slavery. And we talk a lot about community engagement plans in there, more about kind of how to create one, the practicalities and the theory behind it, but also giving resources for your inspiration that you're talking about. So if you just look up my name, or if you look up Kristen Gallus, there is a book that talks about interpreting slavery and difficult histories, but there's a chapter in there specifically about community.
Would there be any just kind of concepts, Dina, outside of like a template or something, that things that you would just be, this kind of sense of shared authority and mutually beneficial partnerships has come up? Would there be other things that you just see as staples of good community engagement strategies or plans?
Yeah, I think that measurement is something. So we've talked a lot of what we've talked about already, that you need to create a baseline that you can measure against. You need to decide who your audience is, and then make sure that you build that trust with them. And so it takes both patience and time to work through that. But you need to focus on kind of who you think your audience is going to be, meeting with them often and deeply, genuinely, to have a strong connection with them, ensuring that you're not jumping from kind of 0 to 100 immediately, that you have a plan in place that goes from one step to another, and ensuring that your community, that you have transparent communication throughout that time. Because I think that often we are working so fast behind the scenes that we forget to even tell our partners what we're doing. And so going from one step to another, and this idea, I again like acceptable risks, right? And so thinking about how you can take something that you think is a little bit risky, talking it out with your partners, and then moving from one step to another, because your your plan is never going to come to an end. You're only going to adapt it and move forward to there. So I think it's about fluidity as well. So those are some general concepts that are not in any kind of particular order off the top of my head, but things to think about.
And we had another question come in, but real quick, I would say also, value the relationship and not the project. And so you're building relationships for long term, not because you have this immediate goal in mind. So we had a question about most of our volunteers are from the local heritage society who seem to have a very specific viewing lens. Do we have suggestions for working on D&I in exhibits and collections with these kinds of volunteers who are part of an outside organization? Any thoughts on the panel?
Volunteers are fabulous. They take a lot of work, I think, but they also bring a lot of benefit. And so, again, when you're thinking about volunteers, it's not us versus them. It's these are our allies, and how can we utilize them, and how can they utilize us? When you're thinking about working in D&I, specifically with volunteers, one of the things that I think is so important is paying attention to triggers, paying attention to things that people think they already know. So often I'll go to an organization and they say, we already did cultural competency 3 months ago. We already took our diversity survey and talked about it last year, during our strategic plan. And so for me, when I'm talking specifically to people who work with volunteers and who may work with outside volunteers as well, it's about how do you kind of integrate those things into everything that you're doing and then positively reinforce that. So sometimes I think that we say, oh, to Kyle's point, I don't have the authority over them. I can't do X, Y, and Z. But just thinking about your place of power and what you do have, how you can incorporate D&I into little things that you're doing along the way, and then positively reinforce that so that then they are thinking of that proactively as well.
And I might just add, we talked earlier about that group that we convened called the Diversity Learning Collaborative. And about 6 months ago, I had somebody who is one of our volunteers ask, "Oh, is that something that's open to volunteers?" And it just totally opened up my way of thinking about it, because before that I had only targeted full-time and part-time staff. But if you have volunteers, part of the reason they're with your organization, I like how Dina said it, these are your allies, and these are people who believe in your mission and what you're advancing. So inviting them into conversations, if you do a book club or if you're going to have a meeting where you get together, if volunteers want to participate in something like that, which they might not all want to do, but for some of your truly devout workers, they might want to be involved in your D&I mission. But the question is, have you as individuals, as people leading this, have you invited them into those spaces? Do they know they exist? Because for me, I had not. And when I thought about that, it totally shifted how I think about training and developing and learning opportunities for people outside of the D&I sphere.
So we are at time. I'd like to just thank the panel for sharing their insight with us, and thank you all for spending the last hour and 15 minutes with us. Again, you can feel free to contact us directly offline if you'd like. We're working on getting all of the email addresses in there right now. So
try that again. There it is.
There we go.
Oh, mine's with a V though.
Oh.
So we'll get them in there, and you can jot those down. And again, we'd be happy to continue the conversation offline. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending that session. I'm going to go ahead and